The Dunning-Kruger effect is when we overestimate our competence, so we think we are better than we really are. The effect is from the hypo and hyper cognitive research, which has also found the false consensus effect. We overestimate other people's competence, so we think we are worse than we really are. Both effects are due to performance misjudgments of either ourselves or others. There are hundreds of studies of finding the effects, but I found a recent paper in sports coaching. That might not sound significant to you, but sports coaches are educators, and so are teachers, content creators, and anyone creating courses online, and there are a few of those around. So the findings, methods, discussion, and limitations of the paper could give us some insight into how we test for educator incompetence. The paper I'm referencing is this one right here, which is an investigation into the Dunning-Kruger effect in sports coaching. Now, the yellow points are my first run points. The red points are the ones that I'm really paying attention to, that I've taken notes on the side here. This is inside of Zotero. So the first point, this research supports the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's fairly obvious that that was the answer. But when we look further into the paper at the methods, you can see, the background, you can see, for example, coaches with higher efficacy have been found to have significantly higher winning percentages than coaches with lower efficacy. So basically, self-efficacy, if someone thinks that they are confident in their ability to get a specific outcome, they are more likely to get good results. And if they don't think that they are good or competent and they have lower self-efficacy, then they are less likely to get good outcomes. So basically it's self-efficacy of the coach or the educator in the environment. And then other research has found that coaching efficacy is positively related to athletes' assessments of coaching behavior. So if the coach thinks they are competent at coaching, then athletes perceive that the coach thinks that they're competent, and so the athlete thinks that they're better at coaching, if that makes sense, or they like their behaviors. And then, as well as coaches, self-reported leadership. So they self-report their leadership behaviors as positive. So they think they're good leaders because they have high self-efficacy in their ability to do something. And this is perceived ability, which is what the Dunning-Kruger effect and the false consensus effect is essentially looking at. And how they measured this in this study was using a coaching efficacy scale. And what I actually did is I had a look at the original paper, and this is the original paper. And what it basically means is the total coaching efficacy predicted coaching behavior, team satisfaction, and winning percentage from the teams. So what this paper found inside of the metric that they're using, the coaching efficacy scale, is that total coaching efficacy predicted coaching behavior. So the test that they used predicted coaching behavior. They also found that total coaching efficacy predicted only coaching behavior across women's teams, which I found interesting. Then you had character building efficacy was negatively related to team satisfaction in women's teams when there was a male coach. So the male coach in women's teams had negative impacts on character building, and then motivation efficacy was positive with a female coach in the women's teams. So they are some of the results that this paper found with the screening method used in the paper that we're going through, and the screening method is here. So this CES is a 24-item instrument. It's a screening, it's like a questionnaire survey. But it's 24 items which coaches are asked to assess the degree of confidence they have in their ability to affect the learning and performance of the athletes. So like I was saying, it's basically a questionnaire saying, are you confident in your ability to get this outcome? And some examples are down here, but they used a Likert scale, which is basically 0 to 10. Are you confident? Yes. Are you not confident? No. And you can see some of the examples here. Can the scale and include how confident are you in your ability to motivate your athletes, promote good sportsmanship, recognize opposing teams' strengths during competition. Those are the sorts of questions that they were using in this model, and those are the sorts of questions that were used in this sort of test. Now, when we apply this into teachers, content creators, they are going to look different. So for a teacher, maybe it's instead of getting a good outcome or a win the weekend, it could be getting a good score on the test or the mock test, or getting a good grade for going to university, those sorts of things. Maybe in content creation, it's getting good views, good view duration, and all the metrics you would see inside of YouTube. But they are perceived abilities of competence rather than actual understanding of whatever the topic is. And the same with teachers, the same with coaches, because it can transfer across. So as we move further down, the final version, because they started with, I think it was like 36, yeah. So they started with 36 measures, which is more than the original paper in here, because the original paper had 24 items, but they started with 36. So they added some different items, some different questions in the questionnaire. They went through some pre-testing and they landed on 27 items. The specific thing here that gets me a little bit is 16 of those items is for teaching technique, and the example they used is when forearm passing the ball, what angle should the arms and body create? Now this study was using volleyball coaches, so coaches just in volleyball, so that's one of the limitations. But teaching technique, how do you know it's right? How do you know it's wrong? And they were using this as a right or wrong answer for technique. And inside of coaching, skill acquisition, and most things in general, there are different ways to approach things. There can be a best approach, the right answer, the fundamentals of doing the thing, or you find your own solutions in the environment that you're in. IP approach, information processing approach, traditionally go with the best answer and molding the coaching and the training and the practice around a specific model. Whereas ecological dynamics typically creates environments where you look to get the person to figure out the way that works for them and then add constraints if it's an ineffective solution that they found. So this screening for techniques, teaching techniques, I'm not a big fan of as using it as a metric for perceived or even actual ability, which is a limitation which we'll go over later on. And then the other 11 are strategy. So they're game related. So seeing, you can see the example, tactically, who would you prefer in rotation more often to block the shot? So ideally you'd want someone tall to block the shot because they can block more, essentially. And the coach's ability to see or help or teach the athletes to recognize that. So they are the 27 items used in this. When we think about this from a teacher, content creator, course creator perspective, what items would you use? What questions would you ask? Can the learner do XYZ? Can the viewer understand XYZ? Do they see the misconceptions, the conceptual changes, or the conflicts in what you're saying, or the models that you're using, or the examples you're giving, or can they apply the habits and the things that you're trying to give, the tips and tricks you're trying to give? Can the viewer actually do it or not? Are you transferring that information? Are you conferring that information across well, efficiently, effectively? Like, what items would you put on there? I don't know, but still interesting to think about. Then, however, when the scores were combined, so we have the technical scores and the strategy scores, but inside of the Dunning-Kruger effect and the consensus effect research, the hypo and hyper-cognitive research, they split it into quartiles. So you have 4 different quartiles. The bottom one typically has the Dunning-Kruger effect, the top one typically has the false consensus effect, and then the middle 2 are just the middle 2. But to create the quartiles, obviously you need to split people up. And they were trying to split them up with both like individual numbers. So you had the technical and the strategic. But as they say here, when the scores were combined to give an overall score, the ability, the variable was normally distributed. But when they weren't combined, 1 point difference on the technique score resulted in a jump of 28 to 72. So basically the samples went from like 4 small quarters to massive groups all over the place, just with a 1 point difference with the answers that they gave. So they combined the scores to make it easier to put the group into quartiles essentially. And they did this by using what's called Z-scores. So because objective and perceived ability were measured on different scales, so the perceived and objective were different scales. So the CES scale that they're using so the CES coaching efficacy scale is different from their actual ability because there were different scores. They used Z-scores to basically bring them together. If you understand stats, great. If you don't, I don't think it's that important unless you're interested in the research, which you can look at in your own time. So these are the results. We have our efficacy scale, which is the coach's perceived ability to do something, and then we have the actual ability. Whether it is actual or not is another question. And these are the results, and this is what it looks like. So this is what you'll see in the hypo and hyper cognitive research, not the curly thingy that you see all over the place. That's not the graph. This is the graph. The Dunning-Kruger effect is here. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is someone's perceived ability. Can you even see that? Yeah, you can. This is someone's perceived ability, and this is their actual ability. So there is a gap in what they think they know and what they actually know. And here on the other side is the consensus effect. So here is what they actually know. Here is what they like, their perceived ability in the group that they're in. So they're overestimating what these people know, and these people are underestimating what they know. That is basically the Dunning-Kruger effect and the consensus effect in a graph, and you can see there it is, present as day, just like the abstract said. But when we move down into the discussion section, this is where I think it can get quite interesting for how we look to not necessarily screen educators, but change educators' views and thoughts on how they assess their own abilities in coaching, educating, and maybe reducing the amount of online courses that are out there because people recognize they don't know as much as they think they know, so maybe they shouldn't be teaching. That's just me off the cuff. So research has shown that contexts characterized by high praise and difficulty in obtaining clear feedback can lead to biases in self-assessment. So basically, what this is saying is if you have high praise and difficulty in obtaining clear feedback, so if you have loads of viewers that are really supportive, yes, you know what you're talking about, or you have students that are looking at you like, yeah, you know everything, then you're going to believe that you know everything. And the clear feedback is suggesting that just because someone has said you're good at it, oh yeah, this was a really good session, why was it good? I don't know. That's not very clear. So you're getting not necessarily bad feedback, but not very useful feedback, because that could, as it says, inflate your own perception. So this perceived ability goes up. So you think you're better than you are because of the feedback and the high praise that you could be getting. So it's actually making the Dunning-Kruger effect even worse, or could be making it worse. And then with respect to feedback, although a coach may define ability in terms of performance, i.e. win-loss ratio, in content creation, that could be views, that could be subscribers, in courses, that could be the amount of people taking the course, not necessarily finishing the course, just taking the course. Again, these metrics can be done and measured by anyone. Teachers, maybe that's even attendance. For higher education, maybe it's just, yes, I have a high attendance in the lecture. This is a plus. Maybe it's because there is an assessment going on and that's why the students are turning up, not because they believe you're competent at what it is that you're doing. Just putting it out there. So this right here, with respect to feedback, although coaches, blah, 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 people could use ambiguous indicators, which is what these examples are. They're ambiguous indicators because they're not actually showing competence. They're not an actual measurement, a true, if you want to use that word, a true ability or a true measure of someone's competence in doing the thing. So using these ambiguous indicators that aren't necessarily accurate can again inflate your position on this graph, so you think you're even higher than you are, and then the Dunning-Kruger effect is worse. Is the Dunning-Kruger effect bad? I can explain that in a different video later on, because that's why I actually read this research for a video that I'm going through. So yeah, and as we move forwards, you can see based on the current results, we would suggest that coaches who are exposed to frequent praise, so if people are listening to lots of praise rather than critique, or getting feedback that isn't that clear, and rely on ambiguous indicators, so all of those indicators that are either not clear or are biased or lean one way, then the success may be prone to inaccurate assessments of their ability. So that sentence right there just basically summarizes what I've been saying, which is if you use a metric to gauge your perceived ability of doing something, it can inflate your perceived beliefs, which I think is kind of obvious, but it's interesting to see that the feedback that people get and the feedback that people choose to use inflates their self-beliefs and self-perceptions of competence. And then on the other side of things, you've got high ability coaches may suffer from the false consensus effect. So these individuals assume that the majority of individuals are as competent as they are. So this paper didn't really look to explore this side of the curve, because most papers don't. Most papers look at this one because this is where a lot of people are most of the time, because of what's called meta-ignorance, which again, I will cover in my longer video about this just general topic. But this area, they assume it's there because it's in all the other studies. And I think that's also going to be there inside of teaching, coaching, educating, and something that's more important, please be quiet, builders. Something that's more important is, I think, the false consensus effect, from my mind, is also the expertise reversal effect from cognitive load theory. So the expert thinks that they're helping when actually they're not, because of misinterpretations or misjudgments of performance. overestimating someone's understanding, etc., what I previously said. Some of the criticisms of this study are similar with all the other research. So one criticism says that noted 2 design characteristics that may influence the results from lab-based studies: accountability and motivation. So the people doing the testing, i.e. the coaches, teachers, content creators, whoever, if they don't have accountability and motivation to give true, realistic answers to the questions that they're being asked, then that might result in the effects. But this has been refuted, I think, pretty well by this study, and they cite the study as expected, which is Erlinger's study from 2008, who found the effect even when the participants were awarded $100 if they were able to determine how well they performed on a test and if they had to justify their assessment to an authority figure. So they're using the authority figure as something for accountability, and they're using the $100 as motivation. So basically, if you answer this question, you get $100, and you're answering this question to an authority figure, so you have accountability to be truthful. And the effects were still shown. So yeah, that's just general research inside of the hypo and hypercognitive research. Moving down towards the discussion part, so we're actually down here now in the notes. It could be argued that self-efficacy is not synonymous with perceived ability. And that's kind of what I've alluded to throughout this video, because self-efficacy, someone's perceived competence of how the outcomes are going to happen, isn't necessarily accurate with perceived ability. Now, they did go on to say, however, in a study summarizing the relationship between perceived and actual ability, these people noted that effect of self-efficacy scales was comparable to that of perceived competency scales, but this study is just one example of how it might work. But there are other examples of how it doesn't work. They don't cite them. But there are examples of how it doesn't work because self-efficacy and perceived ability are obviously impacted by the environments that you're in and your perception or interpretation of what effective is, which is why it's very difficult inside of this sort of research to do measures of performance, Dunning-Kruger effect, consensus effect, in something that is so subjective in your interpretation of what actual ability is. And they go on to say this: the measurement of actual ability may also be a limitation of the study. And then they go on to say a multiple choice test may not be the most valid and reliable way to measure coaching ability. So educators may think that, yes, I'm good at this, but actually it's just because the multiple choice questions lean towards your way of coaching. So if someone thinks, oh yeah, I'm really good at this and I'm going to test this group of people with these metrics, this is what actual coaching is, this is proper coaching, effective coaching, and we're going to give them these questions, people that get those questions right are going to be similar to that coaching effectiveness, but those that aren't would be on the other side. So you could actually have ineffective coaches on the top side because of the questions that were asked, and you could have effective coaches on the bottom side. So of this graph, they could be on the bottom side even though they're effective because of the questions that were asked, because of the interpretation of what effective coaching is, effective education is. And again, this needs to be a general debate in each context that's tested, but I still think that this paper shows that there is the Dunning-Kruger effect in education, that it needs to be explored. And then the final point here, also coaching is a context that provides many different operational definitions of effectiveness. And this right here, inside of sports coaching, there is a definition for effective coaching. It's from Coate and Gilbert 09, I want to say. And we could map that to this testing, which is what I'm looking to do in my research. And if you're interested, obviously have a look at my notes. And if you want to have a look at this paper, what I've actually done, so you can see inside of my meta-ignorance project, I've read the paper. Inside of this one, I'm going to open Markdown Note inside of Obsidian. This is Obsidian, which is what I use for my notes. I have all of the annotated notes, and you can find this on my link in the description. You've got the synopsis, background methods, etc., annotations, and then it's linked to meta-ignorance, which is the project I'm looking to do, and educators. If you open this up, you can see that's where the coaching was, etc., etc. Those that use Obsidian, probably familiar with this. Those that aren't, you will see this when you go into the link. If you go all the way down to the bottom, other notes, you can see YouTube episodes. Click on that and you can see Dunning-Kruger effect in coaching. There is the video, there is the link to the paper for you to have a look at. But the main point I want to get with this video is the Dunning-Kruger effect in educators is there. How we measure it and how we quantify educator incompetence is going to be dependent on what we perceive as effective education. So A question to any of you: what does it mean to be an effective content creator, an effective online course creator, an effective coach, an effective teacher? What does that mean to you? Leave your answers in the comment section below.